Civil Aviation, Sustainable Development and Culture presents Tourism Stakeholders Conference 2021 under the theme Reconnect, Rethink, Rebuild, Stronger Together. Join us on the 4th and 5th of August as we formulate a plan of action to rejuvenate St. Vincent and the Grenadines' tourism and hospitality industry and address stakeholders' concerns while we strengthen the bond between the private and public sectors.
We should be able to get a clearer sense about the states and stakeholders' readiness to receive tourists, whether by air or sea, for the 2021-22 season and beyond.
It is a time for us to strategize the way forward after coming out of a long, hard COVID period.
Encouraging all persons who are part of tourism in our country
to be a part of the solution as we endeavor to rebuild bigger and better for a sustainable tourism industry in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Tourism is everyone's business. Yeah. Live it, love it, embrace it.
On Friday, August 6th, there'll be thousands of dollars to be won. A lotto jackpot of $75,000. A new home, car, or that college education.
Lotto, you have to be in it to win it.
Next lotto jackpot, $75,000.
This evening on the VC3 News Update, Air Canada and Virgin Atlantic to resume flights to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the coming months. This country's Prime Minister betting on Sputnik V to win over hesitant population. And the leader of the opposition, Dr. Godwin Friday, says there would be no tourism sector without widespread immunization. Join us at 7 p.m. for these stories and more on the VC3 News Update.
Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Roundtable Talk. This evening we have as our special guest, once again, Prime Minister, the Honorable Dr. Ralph E. Gonsalves, and we'll be talking about the Public Health Amendment Bill that's due to be introduced in Parliament tomorrow. And of course, there has been much talk about this bill, this act. So, Mr. is here to explain, and I'm going to start by asking him, what exactly does this Public Health Amendment Act set out to do?
Thank you very much, Teresa, and I'm sorry you're not in the studio here, that you're in Barbados with us by Zoom, but we are hearing you quite well. The technology is marvelous.
Definitely.
The bill is a very short bill, the Public Health Amendment Bill, which amends the Public Health Act. And there are two sections to it. One is to empower the Chief Medical Officer to be the person who would oversee any exemption granted to any person in respect of a medical certificate issued by a medical practitioner, an exemption on medical grounds if you're not taking the vaccine. And secondly, is to remove a word, voluntary, by tidying up an amendment which was made on April the 9th last year, an amendment to the Principal Act of 1977. And I think the issue which some persons completely misreading what we are doing is that they're saying that this is to make mandatory a the vaccine. But that's not the case as I've explained it. Indeed, already under law, there is a provision to make vaccines mandatory, a provision in the 1977 Public Health Act. But we have not used that provision, and we do not intend to use that provision. And I'd explain what this provision is and what we are in fact doing. Section 37 of the Act, the 1977 Public Health Act, says, whenever any part of St. Vincent appears to be threatened by any formidable epidemic, endemic, or communicable disease, the Minister of Health may make rules for all or any of the following purposes, namely, and one of the purposes is this: preventing any person from leaving any infected area without undergoing all or any of the following, namely medical examination, disinfection, inoculation, vaccination, or revaccination, and passing a specific period in a place of observation. So if you note the breadth of that particular section, which includes the Minister of Health can take a number of measures in relation to persons in any infected area to do inoculation, vaccination, or revaccination. Now, and this is where, as I said, the community is threatened by a formidable epidemic, endemic, or communicable disease, such as, for instance, COVID-19. In 2020, we did some amendments to this act, and in one of the provisions, it says, section 43B, B2, subsection A. Sorry, A says as follows. Where the Minister of Health has declared a public health emergency, the Minister, on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, may implement special measures to mitigate or remedy the emergency, including A, establishing a voluntary immunization program for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, or any part of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So all the section is doing, all the amendment is doing, is to take out the word establishing a voluntary immunization, to simply say establishing an immunization program, so that there can be no controversy that there's a conflict between this amended provision and the provision of 1977. And that's all what is happening in that regard. Now, we are doing this because we intend, under this law, under the Public Health Act, as amended, all the various amendments, to pass certain regulations. And what the regulations will do, and at that particular time when we pass those regulations, is to say, among other things, that, and those regulations have not yet been passed. In fact, those regulations have not been finalized, but I can speak about our intention, and I have in my hand notes as to what are some of the issues which we'll address in those regulations. Is that any frontline employee in the central government or any of the state enterprises, that any frontline employee, and I would say those which may qualify as frontline employees, that the frontline employees would be required in accordance with their job. It's not the frontline employees as such, but the jobs would require that the person who occupied that position in the front line would take the vaccine. They have a choice as to taking it or not taking it. And I will explain this. Now, a requirement for a job to have, for the person to be vaccinated, that person has the choice. And we will come in relation to that, what any exemptions there may be for that particular individual. And a clear number of persons who may be considered as frontline employees would be, for instance, and we are talking here now in the public sector, doctors and nurses, because we are of the view that even a fisherman or a farmer or some other individual who may not be a frontline employee and who would like to take the vaccine, and we're not going to compel them to take any vaccine and make it mandatory for them to take any vaccine. And they may not even take the vaccine, but if they go to the hospital or a clinic, they would want the doctor or the nurse to be able to say, well, that person who is treating me should be vaccinated. Similarly, if some person is arrested by the police, that's a very intimate act. You would want the police who is on the front line, the policeman or woman, to be vaccinated there in your face. And it would seem to me that in the interest of public health, categories such as these the jobs should require vaccination. And then the person who holds the job can choose whether they want to stay in that job or not to stay in that job. It's not mandatory in that there's a criminal penalty or there's a civil penalty. No, that's not what it is. It's the job which will have the requirement for the occupant of the post to be vaccinated because of the importance of that frontline position. I think the same thing one can reasonably argue for the persons who work at the cruise ship pier, the customs officers who interface with people when they come in at the airports, the immigration officers, the other employees at the airports, for instance, at Argyle International Airport. And remember this, we are under a public health emergency. And these requirements for these posts would last for the period of the emergency. They wouldn't be outside of the public health emergency. And a public health emergency had already been declared since last year. Now, a person may be exempt from taking the vaccine if they're a frontline person, and this would be our intention in the regulations, not in the bill tomorrow. The bill tomorrow is neutral. So an employee in the public sector who is a frontline person who doesn't take the vaccine may be exempt from taking the vaccine on the ground of either a medical ground or on the ground of a religious belief deeply held. Now, in relation to the medical ground,
there are two grounds.
Yes.
Two grounds under which a person
could get the
not
exemption.
take the vaccine.
To the exemptions.
Right.
That the first is one where a certificate from the medical practitioner approved by the chief medical officer, who will make their assessment on medical grounds. And in the case of somebody who objects in good faith and in writing that vaccination is contrary to his or her religious beliefs, And doesn't stop there. And the employer, that is to say the state, the government, or any of the public enterprises, is able to make alternative arrangements to accommodate the employee. Now,
okay, Prime Minister,
the employer may
talk
not
more
be able
about
to
that
accommodate you.
after we come back from our first break. We'll
Yes.
talk some more about that in just a minute.
Yes.
Back in just a moment.
This evening on the VC3 News Update, Air Canada and Virgin Atlantic to resume flights to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the coming months. This country's Prime Minister betting on Sputnik V to win over hesitant population. And the leader of the opposition, Dr. Godwin Friday, says there would be no tourism sector without widespread immunization. Join us at 7 p.m. for these stories and more on the VC3 News Update.
The Ministry of Tourism, Civil Aviation, Sustainable Development and Culture presents Tourism Stakeholders Conference 2021 under the theme Reconnect, Rethink, Rebuild, Stronger, Together. Join us on the 4th and 5th of August as we formulate a plan of action to rejuvenate St. Vincent and the Grenadines' tourism and hospitality industry and address stakeholders' concerns while we strengthen the bond between the private and public sectors.
We should be able to get a clearer sense about the states and stakeholders' readiness to receive tourists, whether by air or sea, for the 2021-22 season and beyond.
It is a time for us to strategize the way forward after coming out of a long, hard COVID period.
Encouraging all persons who are part of tourism in our country to
Be a part of the solution as we endeavor to rebuild bigger and better for a sustainable tourism industry in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Tourism is everyone's business. Yeah. Live it, love it, embrace it.
On Friday, August 6th, there'll be thousands of dollars to be won. A lotto jackpot of $75,000. A new home, car, or that college education.
Lotto, you have to be in it to win it.
Next lotto jackpot, $75,000.
Welcome back. Just to remind you that you can send your questions and comments to our Facebook page, and the Prime Minister, who is also the Minister of Legal Affairs, will be pleased to respond to you. Prime Minister, when we took that break, you were expounding on the two areas where people can in fact be exempted from taking that vaccine.
Yes, and we are talking here, that's not in the bill. That's not in the bill tomorrow. I outlined that the bill tomorrow, the amendment is essentially neutral to ensure that we can make regulations, that there will be no confusion between an amendment which was made last year and the Act of 1977. I want to repeat that as to what is happening tomorrow. And we want to have this neutral provision made so that we can make regulations in relation to certain frontline jobs, that the occupants of those jobs will have the choice of taking the vaccine or not taking the vaccine. If you don't take the vaccine, well, then you get another job. If you don't want to take the vaccine, but you have or even if you want to take it, but you have an exemption, and the exemption you can get only on two grounds. On a certificate by the medical practitioner, approved by the chief medical officer, certifying that the vaccination is not advisable on medical grounds, or the person objects in good faith, the frontline employee objects in good faith, and in writing that vaccination is contrary to his or her religious beliefs, and the employer, that is to say the government or the state enterprise, is unable to make alternative arrangements to accommodate the employee. You can't just say that, and because you declare it, that everything, you're there. If you can't work in a frontline job during a public health emergency without a vaccination, and you say, well, your religion tells you mustn't take a vaccine, well, if the government could accommodate you elsewhere, the public health, the public enterprises could accommodate you elsewhere, so be it. But if not, you look for a different job. Because remember this, in this public health emergency, the following things are arising currently. One, Teresa, there are some deadly, deadly variants in the world, including the Delta, the Brazilian variant, other variants which are emerging, and they're already within the Caribbean. Fortunately, we haven't had them here as yet. But I will tell you the circumstances where they're likely to come here. And everybody knows that once you're having people coming in, and you must have people coming in for the purposes of tourism and the economy. The second thing is that we need to get back as far as practicable to some sense of normalcy, even in the circumstances of COVID-19, in this public health emergency, this pandemic. Because remember this, in October, we have in Virgin Atlantic coming from England, from the United Kingdom. We have in 2 flights a week coming out from the United States. The same thing happening out of Canada. In addition to increased regional travel, we have to make sure that our frontline people are vaccinated, or the persons in those frontline jobs would require vaccination, that you are vaccinated, unless, of course, I say you fall under one of those 2 exemptions in the manner in which I've detailed them. Of course, we are persuading everybody to take the vaccine, because it makes perfect sense to take the vaccine. I repeat all the time, 193 countries in the world, in the United Nations, they and all the mainstream scientists have said, yes, you have to take the vaccine. This has been proven in the laboratories, the efficacy of the vaccines in fighting COVID. But not only the efficacy inside of the laboratories, but also the effectiveness which has come about by the rollout of the vaccine all over the world. And to the extent that there are any minor risks in any medication which you may take, the benefits outweigh by far for the entire society. There are some individuals may feel that they live as atoms, separate and distinct from anybody else in society. Well, unfortunately, that is not the real world. And the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines permits for limitations to be placed on any individual, quote-unquote, freedom for certain requisites. And one of those requisites is public health. It is for the purpose of public health. And that any such restriction or limitation on any individual right is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. And what we are talking about, the regulations which we will make, will fall inside of the 4 walls of the Constitution. This is good for the country. It is good for employers. It is good for employees. It is good for every single person, adult person over the age of 18. Look, there are 2 ways you can get population immunity. 75% of the population or more, I'm talking about the adult population. One, you take the vaccine, whichever of these vaccines which is available. And we have 2 of them available now in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The AstraZeneca and the Sputnik. And we'll get other vaccines too. So that's one, to get population immunity through taking the vaccine. The second way, is for 75% or more of the adult population to get COVID. But if 75% or more of the adult population gets COVID, you can bet your bottom dollar that you're going to have lots of people who are dying. You're going to have a lot of people certainly going to the hospital. You'll have a lot of people getting very sick. And it's going to impact adversely the delivery of health services. Because you may find all the hospital bed have a lot of people with severe COVID. And if you want to do an emergency operation or you want to do an elective operation, you may find that the health services would not be able to accommodate you because of what is happening with this epidemic, with this pandemic. So I think it's important that persons bear in mind what are the dangers of getting immunity by everybody getting COVID, 3/4 of the people getting COVID, the adult population. And bear this in mind too. A more effective immunity by far is to get the vaccine and not to get the COVID. These are clear and scientific propositions. And as a leader, as a government, we have to act within the interests of the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I know and I understand that there are persons who have reservations here and reservations there. And while you're working out those reservations, however, there are certain critical frontline jobs where I think by far most people will say, yes, those individuals should be taking the vaccine. And if they don't want to work there, they can work somewhere else. I go now in respect of what would be the intention in the regulations beyond the vaccine, that is to say in the testing, is that to have a wider group of persons away from frontline, whom regulations may be made that you be tested on a periodic basis so that we can use the traditional forms of early detection and contact tracing, testing, etc., and all the other tools in the toolbox. But science has given us the vaccine, human ingenuity, the gift of God. They've given us the vaccine, and it is important element in the toolbox to fight the COVID. And I think that what I'm saying here is perfectly reasonable. We are not making it mandatory in the sense that you don't have a choice or that you would be fined with alternative for jail or a civil penalty. None of those things. You have a choice if you're in a frontline job, and that frontline job requires vaccination. And that choice is either you go and you have the vaccine, or you don't have the vaccine. If you don't have the vaccine, you get a job elsewhere. It's a free country. Of course, and you exercise your right, there is no criminal or civil penalty for that. Of course, you can get an exemption on the basis of the 2 grounds, the medical grounds or the religious grounds. If it's the religious ground, you'll be able to take advantage of that, but only if the employer is able to make an accommodation for you in another job. And that is what our intention is in relation to the regulations. What is going before the House tomorrow is essentially neutral provisions to tidy up any confusion that there may be between an amendment last April and what the law, the Fundamental Act says, the base act in 1977. That's what that debate is about tomorrow. Simple, straightforward,
Okay, so
in as simple a way in which I can put it. People telling you that Ralph is coming to give children vaccine, absolute rubbish. I'm going to make it mandatory, rubbish. Mandatory is when you say, you know, you use mandatory. The law makes mandatory for motorcyclists to wear helmets. And if you don't wear the helmet, you can get, it'll be a criminal offense. You can have issues where your license taken away. That's when you have something is mandatory. This is not mandatory, what we're talking about. The intention with the regulations to come, but not that tomorrow. Tomorrow, we are just doing a tidying up exercise in relation to the Public Health Act. That's all, so that we can make the regulations without any unnecessary controversy or confusion, and making them in such a way to benefit the country as a whole, and to benefit individuals and their families and their friends and their neighbors. Simple.
Okay. So, Prime Minister, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we have some questions waiting for you to be answered. We'll be back shortly.
I am Hans John, the 2019 Vinci Ragasoka Monarch. I took the COVID-19 vaccine, and so should you. Let's be an example to others. Get vaccinated today and help control the spread of COVID-19.
Vaccinate if you want to eliminate the spread of the virus in our place, and do not procrastinate, but rather let us vaccinate. Get vaccinated today.
The Ministry of Tourism, Civil Aviation, Sustainable Development and Culture presents Tourism Stakeholders Conference 2021 under the theme Reconnect, Rethink, Rebuild, Stronger, Together. Join us on the 4th and 5th of August as we formulate a plan of action to rejuvenate St. Vincent and the Grenadines' tourism and hospitality industry and address stakeholders' concerns while we strengthen the bond between the private and public sectors.
We should be able to get a clearer sense about the states and stakeholders' readiness to receive tourists, whether by air or sea, for the 2021-22 season and beyond.
It is a time for us to strategize the way forward after coming out of a long, hard COVID period.
Encouraging all persons who are part of tourism in our country to
be a part of the solution as we endeavor to rebuild bigger and better for a sustainable tourism industry in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Tourism is everyone's business. Yeah. Live it, love it, embrace it.
Welcome back, and Prime Minister, as I said before we took that last break, I have a question for you. Someone wants you to please define the categories of frontline workers you keep mentioning. Are these already defined in existing legislation? So that's question number one.
Yes. Those, as I've said, Teresa, have not yet been defined. And I was giving examples of what we consider for the purposes of making the relevant regulations after this tidying up bill. And among the persons we'd consider would be nurses and doctors working in the public sector, members of the police force or persons or some particular categories of those. Similarly, the prison staff, people who are dealing with seaports and airports, the immigration officers, the customs officers, the other employees who interact with people when they come. Those are categories which we are thinking about. The regulations have not yet been made in relation to those. But it's the regulations to come to define those posts which would be frontline, and the employees would be frontline employees. As I say, I have before me notes, working notes on what the shape those regulations will take. But those are regulations which would be made in the usual way under statutory rules and orders. All what is happening tomorrow, as I say, is a tidying up exercise to avoid any confusion between any provision, a provision in the law, the amendment last year, with the act itself, so that there can be no idea that the amendment last year restricts in any way that an argument, I don't think the argument can come in law to say that, but to make it patently clear that there's absolutely no conflict. We just take out voluntary, we haven't put in mandatory, and we are not making anything mandatory. We are defining in relation to certain posts which would be occupied by frontline employees. That's so that the question which the person asks is that there's not as yet any definition. We may well have the conversation going on from now. What are some other categories which are frontline? The public may say there should be some other categories, Teresa, which are frontline. I'm only suggesting to you, as leader of the country, leader of the government, the kinds of categories that we are thinking about, which would be seen as frontline positions. And it is my duty, really, since we want to come with these things, it's my duty to say it because, look, I was re-elected as Prime Minister in November. I take very seriously my duties, my obligations. And Paul, apostle, he's servant of the Lord called to be an apostle. In the book of Romans, he said certain things, and I take it as an injunction. He said that those who are teachers must teach. Those who are prophets must prophesy. Those who are leaders must lead. I'm not waiting until I can get everybody to tell me something, or some little group pull me one side, another set of people pull me another side, and as the wind blows I go here and there, and total confusion and the country goes to chaos. No, I've listened, I have read, I have studied the matter, we have had a lot of conversations, and I will have more conversations, Teresa. But government is not a continuing university seminar. At some point, you have to implement certain ideas, certain scientific truths for the good of the country, for the health of the public in a pandemic. And let me make it plain that these regulations which we are talking about, which would be made, these rules, statutory rules and order, which would be made, they would be made within the framework of the law. They're made within the framework of the Constitution. And let me add further. I have a note here in respect to these regulations, which will come. It says that any employee who without reasonable cause or who fails to comply with the requirement, that person would be subjected to the public service regulations in the case of a public officer who is in the front line, or the relevant law in the case of another employee who is working, say, in a state enterprise. So you're not taking away any protections under the public service regulations, but it must be clear that you have a choice. A nurse may well say, listen, I'm not taking the vaccine. I'm not claiming that I have a medical condition where I can't take the vaccine. I'm not claiming any deeply held religious belief. I just ain't taking the vaccine. So, if it's a requirement that I work there and that I must have the vaccine, for that post there must be a vaccine, well, I'll work somewhere else. And it's a free country. You get a job elsewhere.
Okay, so we have a couple questions, and one relating to that last point you made. But the first one is, what is the criteria for exemption, and why is that decision left to the CMO?
Well, the CMO, the decision is not going to be left to the CMO. A medical doctor, an approved medical doctor will make the recommendation, but will say whether the medical condition why this person shouldn't take the vaccine. But the doctor may well be wrong. So that the chief medical officer will no doubt be advised by senior doctors who will say, no. You can't tell me because you stump your toe going down the road and you're taking paracetamol that you can't take the vaccine. Suppose a doctor write that. No, clearly. I mean, let's be serious. It can't just be a fellow just sign it, so it must have some basis connected to the science, which is verifiable. Teresa? I mean, come on. We live in a modern world, you know. And in relation to a deeply held religious belief, nobody is questioning you on that. And you put that in writing. But where the issue comes, all right, you have a deeply held religious belief, you can't take the vaccine. And the employer will try reasonably to see if you can be placed elsewhere to accommodate you. But if the employer can't accommodate you, well, with your religious belief, you can't work in that position. Again, it's a free and democratic country. You have a choice. That's the point I'm emphasizing all the time.
Okay, so I'm going to shoot you two more questions before we take our final break. Somebody is saying, where are you going to place these nurses? Do you have trained and qualified nurses to take up these positions? And someone else is asking, Prime Minister, what plan will be in place to also protect those frontline workers who may be exposed by tourists who are also not vaccinated?
Well, let's deal with the last question first. When you're entering St. Vincent and the Grenadines and you're a tourist, even if you're vaccinated, currently, you still have to come with a PCR test, and you have to take a PCR test here. And depending on the country you're coming from, how it is assessed, is 2 days quarantine, or 7 days, or 14 days. If you come from a country, if you come and you're not vaccinated, you'll be quarantined for 14 days. That's the current protocol. So that the chances of somebody who, first of all, a tourist who is unvaccinated, when they come into the country, they come in with a PCR negative test. They get tested here, PCR negative. They still have to go in quarantine, you know, for a particular period of time. A longer period of time than if they are vaccinated. Now, the first question about the nurses is that if the nurses decide that they ain't taking the vaccine, do you have nurses to fill the positions? Well, we will provide that service which is available for the existing nurses. And we have other trained nurses in the country who are not yet employed, whom we will recruit, who presumably will take the vaccine. Now, I am satisfied that the bulk of the nurses and doctors will take the vaccine. You want to tell me, I've seen the list of the nurses at Modern Medical. Overwhelmingly, they are not vaccinated. When I say overwhelmingly, at the hospital, the nurses are about 25% vaccinated. 25% of them. Up in Modern Medical, I don't even know if you have 5% or 10%. That can't be serious. Huh? So I believe that those persons who are there, and I know lots of them, they're good and sensible people. They will say what Ralph is saying there is true. Look, I take the vaccine. I take my 2 doses. Nothing happened to me. You ever hear anybody in St. Vincent and the Grenadines who take the vaccine, anything wrong with them? And I say to young people, persons 18 years old, in their 20s, in their 30s, they will say, well, they're strong. But you know what happened? There are strong people who get COVID and it knocked them down and killed them. I've seen many cases like those, examples in Britain and the United States. In any case, even though you don't get killed and you get this COVID seriously, you can get what is called long COVID. It affects your heart, it scars your lungs, it humbugs the quality of your life, and later on, it may even make you not live as long as you should have lived. We need to have a healthy population. A lot of what you get on social media and all sorts of different things, a lot of things which are just so hysterical and wrong. And I said to the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, do you think that Ralph who has served you the way in which I have served you, that I will come to you to put something to you which is not good for you, which is detrimental to you. You know that. I wouldn't do that. And who you
Okay,
whose voice,
we'll come
whose
back
voice
for
you're going to
final
choose?
segment.
You're going to choose the, let me just say this, Teresa, you're going to choose the voice of an experienced servant like Ralph and go for some fly-by-night lawyer or some trade union leader who may have his own personal grouse. This is not about Ralph, you know. This is about the country. The good of the country. And that's the point I want to make.
This evening on the VC3 News Update, Air Canada and Virgin Atlantic to resume flights to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the coming months. This country's Prime Minister betting on Sputnik V to win over hesitant population. And the leader of the opposition, Dr. Godwin Friday, says there would be no tourism sector without widespread immunization. Join us at 7 p.m. for these stories and more on the VC3 News Update.
The Ministry of Tourism, Civil Aviation, Sustainable Development and Culture presents Tourism Stakeholders Conference 2021 under the theme Reconnect, Rethink, Rebuild, Stronger, Together. Join us on the 4th and 5th of August as we formulate a plan of action to rejuvenate St. Vincent and the Grenadines' tourism and hospitality industry and address stakeholders' concerns while we strengthen the bond between the private and public sectors.
We should be able to get a clearer sense about the states and stakeholders' readiness to receive tourists, whether by air or sea, for the 2021-22 season and beyond.
It is a time for us to strategize the way forward after coming out of a long, hard COVID period.
Encouraging all persons who are part of tourism in our country to
Be a part of the solution as we endeavor to rebuild bigger and better for a sustainable tourism industry in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Tourism is everyone's business. Yeah. Live it, love it, embrace it.
Welcome back. Couple of questions. Program. The first, what provisions will be made, if any, through the Service Commission's Department for persons who are categorized as frontline workers who choose not to take the vaccine on their own beliefs? I think somewhere along the line that may have been answered already.
Yes.
And there's another, who is the decision left to then? If someone is not asking for medical exemption, who is the determining authority?
Well,
who is on there for you?
No, what is going to happen? There will be a list of medical doctors who you'll go to, and the certificate will be sent in. The chief medical officer will no doubt, with other senior doctors, see whether it is a genuine exemption or not a genuine exemption. You know, that's straightforward. That's straightforward. What the alternative, I hope the questioner is not suggesting that every doctor, including the anti-vaxxers among the medical profession, that there will be a beeline to him or her, and they just sign up a lot of exemptions. And you accept them? That couldn't be serious. You couldn't be serious. No, nobody could seriously say that. It has to be something really grounded in science, in medical science. And those exemptions, the basis is fairly well known. You can't treat this, you know. You know, you can't say a fella, you know, a guy, a sanitation worker might meet a doctor outside of Graves supermarket on a Saturday. He said, Doc, on Monday, you know, I'm going to get sick. I want you to give me sick leave next week. Eh? And the fella write it up outside of Graves and give you in your hand a sick leave certificate. It can be like that. Come on. We live in, well, I certainly live in a real world, eh?
Okay. Another quick question. Can a private sector business request its employees to be vaccinated, as was done by a Kingston-based company recently? And would that company be within its rights to dismiss employees who refuse to be vaccinated?
Well, I think the issue is vaccination or quarantining, depending on the circumstances of the job. I don't know, because there's a common law right of an employer to make sure that he has a healthy environment for work. And an obligation of the employee, the worker, is to cooperate with the employer to have a healthy working environment. Let's understand that. So that if the employee says, I'm not taking the vaccine, and the worker says that, and the employer says, well, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to work here. Or if you don't take the vaccine, given the nature of your job, you have to take a test every Monday or every other Monday, and you're not prepared to do that. And they retrench you, they dismiss you. That's it. Because they would have been exercising their right, the employer, to have a safe, a healthy system of work. Understand this, Teresa, that in an employment unit, if you are vaccinated and others inside there are vaccinated, but Ralph and Tom and Ephraim are not vaccinated, you can go to your employer and say, you do not have a safe place, a healthy environment for me to work. So I'm writing you to tell you, until you impose vaccination or testing requisites for the jobs what we are doing, I'm giving you notice that I'm staying home because you're not providing me somewhere safe. And while you stay home, the employer would have to pay you. Because you're prepared, you have taken measures, you know, to go along with him, with your employer requisites. So don't think it's only the right of a person who denies, who doesn't want to take the vaccine. What about the person who exercises his or her right to take the vaccine and have to work in the same place with persons who are unvaccinated? These things have been adjudicated upon, what I'm talking about here, in common law countries in Europe, in North America, in Australia, in New Zealand, in other countries across the world. And what I'm saying here, they have come down on the side of what I'm talking about, because it complies with legal requisites. Now, an earlier question you asked, if the nurse doesn't take the job, take the jab, take the vaccine, and he or she, that nurse, doesn't have any of the exemptions, and the exemptions are in order in every way, and an alternative accommodation could be made on the religious ground, what the employer doesn't have an obligation, the government doesn't have an obligation to look for a job for that nurse, you know. The nurse has a choice. People tend to forget that, you know. he or she has a choice. Am I going to work where there is a requirement for me to take the vaccine or not? There's a requirement for me to take the vaccine, and you choose not to take the vaccine. You have exercised your choice. You're saying, well, the employer gives me a job, this is a requirement. I'm not going along with that. I'm a free agent, I'm in a free country, and long may be it so. The nurse goes and looks for a job elsewhere. She can set up her own private practice and say, I'm not vaccinated, I'm put it up proudly. I am an unvaccinated nurse. I'm standing on principle. Come and visit me. We'll see how much money she'll make. You know, a lot of people talking, but there's a certain cognitive dissonance in some of these things, which I would like to talk through and have a conversation with people as I'm having here with you, Teresa. And I'm glad the questions are coming in. But as I say, we have been having a long conversation on these matters. And government is not a continuing university seminar. A point has to reach, and we are at that point to take certain serious decisions. I can't make it any plainer.
And before you go, you have explained that this amendment is really a tidying up of the previous act. But there's a school of thought that is saying that this is in fact making the way for mandatory vaccination.
Absolutely not.
How do you go about rubbishing that notion?
Well, all I could do is I give the examples and I explain it. And if persons don't want to see it, when they see the regulations, they will see that they have a choice. There's not going to be any compulsion. There's not going to be a fine. There's not going to be a civil penalty. And everything will be done within the framework of the law and the Constitution. And we're not touching the Constitution, you know, your fundamental rights are still there. And the authority of the state is still there, you know, in relation to your fundamental rights and freedoms. There are some people who want anarchy, want civilization as we know it. Order to fall down, mash up, broke down. Well, that can't be proper. That can't be sensible. And there are some people, including some of our nationals overseas, who, following what is happening in America, there are some nurses who working in hospitals in America in order for them to hold their jobs, are taking the vaccine. And nothing is wrong with them. But they want to tell the nurses here, don't take it. Some of them doing that. No, that can't be right. We have to look out for the good of our country, the public health of our country. And one of the things which some political opportunists are doing, they say, I take the vaccine. They talk out of this side of the mouth, take the vaccine. But on the other side of the mouth, everything they say is to tell you don't take the vaccine. That kind of hypocrisy will be exposed as we go along. And that is not leadership, you know. They're following a set of, well, you know whom I normally call the internet crazies. They're following them and not leading. That's why I saw the comment by Sinclair Leacock in a newspaper, and I heard about it that he was on radio, talking, he said that he will put his political, his job, his political future on the line in supporting the vaccination process. And also, he quoted me, I understand, I didn't hear it, but it seems to me that if what I heard, and we'll find out tomorrow in the parliament, I don't know if he may say something different tomorrow, but as I was informed, I understand that he's holding a reasonable line on this matter. And I want the 20-something thousand persons who already take the vaccine to say, we have taken the vaccine and we're okay. Please take it. They don't want a nurse who's not unvaccinated to deal with them, or a medical doctor, or to go to an immigration officer when they're coming in, or a customs officer, turning up the clothes and everything, and in your face they might have on the mask. But as we know, that is not the best tool in the toolbox. Science, through the ingenuity of man, which God has given us now a very important tool, the vaccine. Let's be sensible and use it now to keep ourselves safe. That's the story. Why are we fighting that?
And thank you so very much, Prime Minister. I think that's the perfect note on which to end this evening's edition of Roundtable Talk, as the government takes the Public Health Amendment Bill to the Parliament tomorrow. Thank you for listening, and do enjoy your Wednesday evening. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.